"Excuse me, ma'am. This is not your line," the teller said sharply, barely glancing up from her computer screen, and Evelyn Johnson's eyes narrowed slightly, not with fear, but with the quiet determination of someone who had faced the world on her own terms for 72 years. The bank's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glare over the polished marble floors and reflecting off the chrome edges of the teller counter, making every movement seem magnified, each footstep echoing. In the vast lobby, as a few customers paused mid-motion to glance at the small commotion, the air thick with the subtle tension of disapproval and expectation, Evelyn shifted her purse slightly, feeling the weight of it against her hip, the leather worn and soft, carrying decades of receipts, letters, and small mementos of a life carefully lived, and she took a measured breath, allowing the calm she cultivated over the years to settle over her shoulders like a familiar shawl, as Mr. Carlton Hayes, the bank manager, stepped into view, tall and composed, with his crisp navy suit perfectly pressed and his polished shoes tapping in rhythm against the tile floor, exuding the kind of confidence that bordered on intimidation, his eyes scanning Evelyn with a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled condescension. "Are you certain you're at the right branch, ma'am?" he asked, voice smooth and controlled, yet carrying an undercurrent of authority that made the surrounding space feel smaller. And Evelyn straightened fully, lifting her chin, her voice calm and clear but carrying the weight of years of experience and dignity. "I am certain, sir, and I am here to complete my transaction just like any other customer." And a few murmurs rose from the nearby line, soft and uncertain, as people sensed the tension in her tone, the way it balanced respect with assertiveness, and the subtle strength she projected without raising it, without demanding attention, her hands resting lightly on the counter as if she had every right to be there, because she did. The teller glanced up again, hesitated, and then typed more slowly, the clacking of keys echoing in rhythm with Evelyn's heartbeat as she kept her gaze steady on the screen, refusing to shrink into the role the teller had tried to assign her. While Mr. Hayes stepped closer, folding his arms, the sheen of his watch catching the light, making him look even more imposing. "Do you have identification, documentation, proof of your account?" he asked, each word deliberate, carefully measured to assert control, and Evelyn met his eyes, unflinching, producing her wallet with hands that were steady and sure, sliding her ID across the counter with a quiet flourish, the laminated card reflecting the light in a small prism across the floor, capturing the attention of a nearby child who peeked from behind his mother's coat. And as Mr. Hayes examined the ID, Evelyn's eyes swept the room subtly, noting the polished brass handles of the doors, the soft murmur of conversation, the faint scent of freshly printed forms, the gentle clink of coins in the change tray, all ordinary details made extraordinary by the tension in the air. And then, as if sensing the patience and resolve emanating from Evelyn, the teller hesitated, glancing toward Mr. Hayes with a barely perceptible shrug. The manager's eyes narrowed slightly, and a thin smile flickered across his lips, almost imperceptible, as if he had begun to recognize the quiet authority that did not rely on words, the calm yet unshakable presence of a woman who had lived a lifetime learning to hold her ground. And the lobby seemed to exhale slowly, the sharp edges of hostility softening, as Evelyn prepared to speak, not with anger or frustration, but with clarity, stating the precise details of her request, the numbers, the forms, the verification of her account, each word measured and unhurried, carrying with it a subtle insistence that demanded attention without shouting. And as the sentences unfolded, a faint murmur of acknowledgement passed through the waiting customers, a few leaning slightly forward to catch every word, the humming fluorescent lights above casting a rhythm over the scene, the polished marble reflecting the quiet dignity of Evelyn Johnson standing her ground, the subtle authority in her posture, the calm strength in her voice, and the way she allowed the ordinary details of the bank, the pens, the paper stacks, the counter edges, the distant ticking of a clock, to frame her presence as something extraordinary in that moment, a gentle tension holding the room suspended, waiting to see whether the quiet dignity of a single elderly woman could influence the balance of power in that space. And for the first time, Mr. Hayes' eyes lingered on her longer than necessary, the faintest trace of reconsideration. appearing, a momentary pause that seemed to stretch and bend time itself, leaving the audience suspended, their attention fixed entirely on Evelyn and the subtle authority she carried without ever raising her voice, setting the stage for the inevitable revelation that would come. Evelyn Johnson remained still, the crisp air of the bank lobby pressing softly against her skin, a faint hum of conversation carrying from the teller line, while the polished marble reflected the fluorescent glow in a way that made every movement seem deliberate. And for a moment, she simply observed, taking in the subtle gestures of the people around her, the nervous glance of a young man adjusting his tie, the slight frown of a woman clutching a leather purse, the rhythmic tap of shoes against the floor as someone moved purposefully toward the exit, and she allowed herself a quiet exhale, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her like a familiar coat, knowing that the presence of Mr. Hayes, standing tall with his arms folded, had created a pressure that everyone in the room was now aware of. The invisible walls of authority pressing in but failing to diminish the calm she had cultivated through years of experience. She adjusted her scarf lightly, the soft fabric brushing against her cheek, a small, deliberate motion that drew no notice except from those who were already attuned to the tension, and she glanced once more at the identification and paperwork laid out neatly on the counter, the edges of the documents aligned as if by intention, the ink crisp and clear, each number and signature speaking louder than words could, a testament to her preparedness and quiet confidence. And she felt the subtle shift in the room as the tellers paused, their fingers hovering over keyboards, pens still in midair, glances exchanged in silent acknowledgement that the situation was no longer ordinary. The familiar cadence of the bank replaced by an anticipatory stillness, and Evelyn allowed her eyes to meet those of Mr. Hayes, noticing the slight tightening of his jaw, the narrowing of his eyes, a flicker of curiosity crossing his face, the first crack in the polished exterior of control that he presented so carefully to the world. She spoke softly, her words deliberate and precise. All of my documents are in order, and I would appreciate completing my transaction without further delay. Her tone steady, not confrontational, but filled with an undeniable authority born from clarity and certainty, and the sound of her voice seemed to ripple outward, the hum of the fluorescent lights above accentuating the resonance of each syllable as it reached the far corners of the lobby, touching the ears of onlookers who had unconsciously held their breath, the energy shifting subtly, the tension bending toward possibility. As Mr. Hayes leaned forward slightly, examining the paperwork with a more careful gaze than before, a faint crease appearing on his forehead, a silent acknowledgement of the legitimacy she carried without need of argument, and the subtle movements of his body, the adjustment of his cuff, the slight tilt of his head, conveyed a mind beginning to reconsider the assumptions that had dictated his initial reaction, while Evelyn remained poised, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter, the polished surface cool beneath her fingertips, every gesture measured, conveying a presence that did not demand but commanded attention. And in that suspended moment, the other patrons shifted minutely, leaning in, their curiosity piqued, drawn by the quiet strength she exuded without arrogance, the faint scent of her lavender hand cream lingering subtly, blending with the institutional aroma of paper, ink, and polished marble. And as the seconds stretched, the air thick with anticipation, Evelyn's eyes scanned the room once more, noting the small details, the subtle interplay of expressions, the gentle sway of a customer checking her watch, the barely audible sigh of a man adjusting his jacket, all ordinary movements rendered extraordinary by the quiet tension she embodied. And in that deliberate observation, a soft, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of her lips, the kind that spoke of patience, resolve, and the unshakable dignity that had carried her through decades. And as Mr. Hayes' eyes met hers again, the silent communication between them was palpable, the room holding its collective breath, waiting to see if the quiet authority of a single woman could shift the balance in a space constructed to assert control. And for the first time, the sharp edges of his composure softened, the rigid alignment of his posture bending subtly toward consideration. And in that almost imperceptible moment, Evelyn Johnson stood as a testament to the power of clarity, preparation, and unwavering poise, the subtle cadence of her presence creating a rhythm in the lobby that demanded recognition without a word raised in anger, a quiet anticipation hanging in the air that suggested something significant was about to unfold. Evelyn Johnson shifted her weight slightly, the soft leather of her purse creaking under her hand as the bank lobby seemed to hold its breath around her, the subtle hum of the fluorescent lights above blending with the distant murmur of conversation and the faint shuffle of polished shoes against the marble floor, each sound heightened by the charged silence that had fallen after her calm assertion. And she allowed her gaze to sweep over the room once more, noticing the expressions of the people nearby, the careful watchfulness of a mother holding her child, the tentative glance of a young man counting his papers, the slow turning of heads as whispers floated in the air like delicate threads, all eyes drawn to the poised figure standing at the counter, unwavering and composed, her presence a quiet anchor in the midst of uncertainty. Mr. Carlton Hayes straightened slightly, the crease between his brows deepening as he considered the documents Evelyn had presented, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the edge of his desk, each tap punctuating the heavy atmosphere, a subtle tension radiating from him as he weighed the situation, and Evelyn, aware of the faint shift in his posture, maintained her steady composure, her hands resting lightly on the counter, her movements measured and deliberate, the faint scent of lavender from her hand cream drifting softly, mingling with the subtle aroma of polished marble and paper, grounding her in the sensory details of the space as she prepared for what she knew might come next, a potential challenge to her quiet authority. The teller glanced up from her screen again, hesitation evident in her movements, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she processed the clarity and correctness of Evelyn's paperwork, and the soft click of a pen being set aside punctuated the lobby's stillness, each sound amplified in the charged air, signaling the collective recognition of competence and calm in the elderly woman before them. Evelyn allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging the moment, her eyes catching the subtle shift in Mr. Hayes' gaze, the slight narrowing of his eyes, and the faint tilt of his head indicating a reconsideration, a recognition that the situation was no longer guided by assumption or prejudice but by the undeniable presence of truth and dignity. And she spoke again, her voice steady, resonant, each word carefully chosen. Everything here is complete and accurate, and I am prepared to proceed with my transaction. And the words, though soft, carried a weight that made the room lean in, the ambient noise fading against the clarity and authority she projected. A few customers shifted in their seats. The rhythmic tapping of keys from distant workstations paused momentarily, and the slight clink of a coin in a nearby teller's tray seemed louder against the hush. All ordinary sounds reframed by the intensity of the unfolding moment, as Evelyn's calm presence began to subtly alter the energy of the space, instilling a quiet sense of order and expectation in place of the earlier tension. Mr. Hayes' eyes lingered on her, the subtle movements of his hands and the minuscule adjustments of his posture betraying an internal conflict, the rigid mask of authority giving way to a moment of reflection as he realized the understated power in Evelyn's composure, her precise articulation, and the unassuming confidence she brought to the counter. And as he absorbed the reality of the situation, the room seemed to hold an almost tangible pause, every breath and shuffle of paper resonating in the quiet, accentuating the unspoken acknowledgement of her presence and the shift in dynamic that had occurred without a single raised voice, leaving the space suspended in a delicate balance between expectation and revelation. The ordinary lobby transformed by the extraordinary poise and quiet strength of Evelyn Johnson, standing as a living testament to dignity, clarity, and the subtle authority that commands respect through action and calm certainty alone. Mr. Carlton Hayes finally exhaled, though the sound was barely audible, more a shift in posture than a release of breath, and he placed Evelyn's identification card down on the counter with a measured precision that suggested control, yet his fingers lingered a fraction longer than necessary, as if the simple act required more consideration than he had anticipated. And the faint ticking of a wall clock somewhere behind the glass offices grew louder in the silence, each second stretching thin, pulling the attention of everyone in the lobby tighter around the moment. Evelyn did not move, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze steady, her presence grounded in a quiet certainty that did not waver, and the soft fabric of her coat brushed lightly against the counter as she shifted her stance just enough to remain comfortable, her movements economical, deliberate, never hurried, as though time itself bent slightly around her calm. Mr. Hayes cleared his throat, the subtle sound echoing more than it should have in the stillness, and he glanced toward the teller, who immediately straightened, her fingers hovering uncertainly over the keyboard, awaiting instruction that did not come as quickly as expected, and the hesitation created a ripple, a small but undeniable break in the rhythm of authority that usually governed the room. "There seems to be a discrepancy," Mr. Hayes said finally, though his voice lacked the earlier sharpness, now tempered with a cautious neutrality, and Evelyn's eyes softened just slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, as if she had anticipated this moment, as if she had seen this exact hesitation play out in different forms across years and places. And she responded without delay, her tone even. "Then let us clarify it together." And the simplicity of her words seemed to settle over the room like a gentle weight, shifting the dynamic from confrontation to process, from assumption to verification. A man near the back adjusted his stance, leaning subtly to get a better view, while a woman near the entrance paused mid-step, her hand resting lightly on the glass door, held there by curiosity rather than urgency, and the faint hum of the building's air system became more noticeable, filling the silence between exchanges like a low, steady breath. Mr. Hayes reached for a folder, flipping it open with controlled efficiency, though the slight stiffness in his movement suggested that his confidence had been nudged, if only slightly, and he scanned the documents again, more carefully this time, his eyes moving slower, his brow furrowing as he processed each line, each number, each signature, in the act of rechecking, of reconsidering, carried its own quiet admission, one that did not need to be spoken aloud. Evelyn watched without impatience, her hands now loosely clasped in front of her, her fingers resting against one another in a relaxed but attentive posture, and she allowed her gaze to drift momentarily to the edges of the room, taking in the reflections on the marble floor, the soft flicker of light against the glass panels, the subtle movements of people who no longer pretended not to notice. And then she returned her attention to Mr. Hayes, anchoring the moment once more. "Everything aligns with the account records," the teller said quietly after a few seconds, her voice tentative but clear, and the words seemed to land with more weight than expected, creating a small but significant shift in the air, as if a hidden balance had just tilted. Mr. Hayes paused, his fingers resting on the edge of the folder, and for a brief moment, the confident posture he had carried earlier seemed to falter, replaced by something more human, more reflective, and he looked up at Evelyn, really looked this time, not through her, not past her, but at her, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, dense with recognition, with the unspoken realization that the situation had changed, that the assumptions that had shaped the first moments of their interaction no longer held the same weight. Evelyn did not smile, but there was a warmth in her eyes, a quiet steadiness that conveyed neither triumph nor resentment, only presence, only truth. And as the seconds stretched once more, the room remained suspended, every small sound, every subtle movement amplified by the awareness that something had shifted beneath the surface, something that could not easily be reversed, leaving Mr. Hayes standing at the edge of a decision that would define not just the outcome of a transaction, but the tone of everything that would follow. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like a weight being moved across the room, and Mr. Carlton Hayes straightened his back, the folder still open in his hands, his fingers pressing lightly against the paper as if grounding himself in the facts now laid clearly before him. And for a moment he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the documents, then drifting upward again to Evelyn Johnson, who remained exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, her presence steady as the marble beneath her feet, and the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed louder now, filling the gap between them as every person in the bank waited for what would come next. The teller shifted slightly, her chair creaking softly, her eyes moving between Mr. Hayes and Evelyn, uncertainty flickering across her face as the earlier confidence she had borrowed from authority began to fade, replaced by a quiet awareness that the situation had turned, not dramatically, not loudly, but undeniably, and Evelyn, sensing the shift without needing to look directly at anyone, allowed her hands to rest more comfortably on the counter, her fingers lightly touching the smooth surface, her breathing even, measured, as though she had stepped into a rhythm that no one else in the room had quite found yet. Mr. Hayes finally spoke, his voice lower than before, less sharp, more deliberate. "Everything appears to be in order," and the words seemed to settle over the room like a soft but unmistakable signal, the kind that changes direction without announcing it. And a faint murmur passed through the nearby customers, not loud enough to disrupt the moment, but enough to mark the shift, the subtle acknowledgement that something had just been corrected, something that had almost gone the other way. Evelyn inclined her head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than victory, her eyes remaining steady, her expression composed, and she replied, "Then I would like to proceed," her tone unchanged, calm and respectful, yet carrying a quiet finality that left no room for further doubt. And Mr. Hayes nodded once, a small movement, but one that seemed heavier than any gesture he had made before, as if it carried the weight of reconsideration, of correction, of something unspoken that had passed between them. The teller began typing again, her fingers moving more carefully now, each keystroke precise, deliberate, the sound echoing softly in the stillness as the system processed Evelyn's request, and the faint glow of the screen reflected in her eyes as she double-checked each detail, no longer rushing, no longer dismissing, but paying attention, real attention, the kind that had been missing only minutes before. Evelyn watched the process without impatience, her gaze occasionally drifting to the reflections on the floor, the quiet movements of people resuming in slow increments, the man adjusting his tie again, the woman near the door finally stepping outside, though she glanced back once more before leaving, as if unwilling to fully disengage from the moment, and the rhythm of the bank began to return, but it was not quite the same. Something subtle had changed, something that lingered beneath the surface. Mr. Hayes closed the folder gently, placing it aside with care. His movements now measured in a different way, less about control and more about awareness, and he looked at Evelyn again, his expression no longer guarded, but thoughtful, as if he were seeing not just a customer, but a person whose presence had quietly altered the space around them. And though he did not speak further, the pause itself carried meaning, a silent recognition that did not need to be voiced. The teller printed the transaction receipt, the software of the machine breaking through the quiet, and she slid the paper across the counter with both hands, a small but noticeable change in gesture, and Evelyn accepted it with a gentle nod, her fingers brushing the edge of the receipt, the paper crisp and warm, and for a brief moment, her eyes moved across the printed numbers, confirming what she already knew, that everything was as it should be. She placed the receipt carefully into her purse, the worn leather opening with a familiar softness, and as she closed it, the subtle click of the clasp echoed lightly, a quiet punctuation to the moment, and she lifted her gaze once more, meeting Mr. Hayes' eyes, not with challenge, not with resentment, but with a calm steadiness that held its own kind of message, one that lingered longer than words could, and then, without haste, without ceremony, she turned slightly, preparing to step away from the counter, her posture unchanged, her presence still carrying that quiet authority, leaving behind a space that felt just a little different than it had before, as if something invisible had been set back into balance, even if no one could quite put it into words yet. Evelyn Johnson took a slow, deliberate step back from the counter, her polished shoes gliding softly across the marble floor, the subtle echo of each movement marking the quiet authority she carried without a word. And the bank lobby seemed to breathe around her, the ambient hum of the air system mingling with the soft shuffle of papers and the distant clicking of computer keys. All ordinary sounds now reframed by the tension she had held and released with measured calm. Mr. Carlton Hayes remained at the counter, his hands resting lightly on the folder, eyes tracing the lines of the documents once more, the sharp angles of his suit softened in the warm fluorescent light, his posture betraying a hesitation, a silent contemplation as he reconciled the earlier assumption of control with the undeniable clarity that Evelyn's presence had brought to the space. and the subtle lift of his brow hinted at a reluctant recognition of the poise she had displayed, a recognition that did not require applause or acknowledgement, only awareness, and it resonated quietly through the room, touching the people waiting in line, the tellers adjusting their stances, and even the security personnel standing by the entrance, whose posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if the gravity of her calm had reached them as well. Evelyn's hands remained gently clasped in front of her, the faint creases of her coat falling naturally around her frame, and she allowed her gaze to sweep over the lobby, noticing the small, human details that had returned to motion, the woman checking her watch, the young man nervously shifting the papers in his hand, the subtle sway of a customer leaning on the counter, each movement now tempered by the quiet acknowledgement of the shift in the air, a change that had been invisible a moment ago and now made itself felt with a gentle insistence. She spoke softly, her voice carrying the weight of measured confidence. "I appreciate your assistance in confirming the details." And the words, though unassuming, seemed to anchor the moment, drawing attention not to confrontation but to the undeniable order and correctness she had presented. And the tellers nodded subtly, their fingers moving with renewed attentiveness as they processed the transaction, the rhythmic tapping of keys sounding almost ceremonial in the hushed lobby, marking the quiet passage from tension to resolution. Mr. Hayes finally set the folder aside completely, his fingers brushing lightly over the polished surface of the counter, and he took a subtle step back, a gesture that conveyed neither defeat nor concession, but a recognition of presence, of dignity. And the room held its breath as he lifted his gaze to Evelyn once more, the faintest trace of reconsideration in the tilt of his head, a pause that spoke volumes without a single word being exchanged, and the ambient sounds, the hum of fluorescent lights, the soft shuffle of papers, the distant phone ringing, filled the space with a new rhythm, one subtly altered by the quiet power she had exhibited. Evelyn allowed a slow blink, a measured acknowledgement of the shift, before gathering the edges of her coat with a soft, practiced motion, the fabric whispering lightly as she adjusted it around her shoulders. And in that simple gesture, the authority she had held silently radiated outward, touching the observers, compelling a recognition that was neither demanded nor requested, only acknowledged naturally as the moment unfolded. A customer near the doorway paused, leaning slightly on the glass, watching, curiosity mingled with admiration, while another adjusted her purse, eyes briefly meeting Evelyn's with an unspoken understanding of the balance that had just shifted, the ordinary space of the lobby transformed by her calm, deliberate presence into a place where attention and respect could not be ignored. The air itself seemed to carry a subtle charge, a soft but palpable energy that lingered in the polished corners of the room, and Evelyn, sensing the completion of this part of her purpose, allowed herself a small, controlled exhale, steadying her posture as she prepared for the next step. Knowing that the clarity she had brought, the quiet insistence on correctness and dignity, had not only influenced the manager, but had set the tone for the rest of the space, leaving the bank lobby subtly realigned, measured, and respectful, a quiet testament to the power of patience, precision, and unshakable composure in the face of doubt. Evelyn Johnson felt the subtle shift in the air as Mr. Carlton Hayes straightened in his chair, the faint creak of leather and polished metal filling the space as his fingers lingered over the counter, a hesitant acknowledgement of the authority she carried without raising her voice, and she allowed herself a quiet scan of the room, noting the expressions of the bystanders, the slight widening of eyes, the soft nods, the small gestures of curiosity and respect, all movements magnified in the suspended tension of the bank lobby, while the hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed to mark each heartbeat in the space, the distant clatter of pens and soft shuffle of papers providing a subtle rhythm that underscored the gravity of the moment. Mr. Hayes cleared his throat, a sound that echoed slightly against the polished marble floors, and he adjusted his suit jacket, the motion deliberate, signaling a pause, a reconsideration, a silent negotiation with himself, as if weighing the decorum of authority against the undeniable dignity before him. And his eyes met Evelyn's once more, the scrutiny softened, replaced with a measure of respect, the slightest furrow in his brow suggesting the internal dialogue that had begun, The recognition that the situation had shifted in ways he had not anticipated, and Evelyn remained still, posture straight, her hands resting lightly on the counter, her calm and unspoken assertion that the correctness of her documents and the integrity she displayed carried weight that did not need to be argued or imposed. It simply existed, palpable and undeniable, and the room seemed to bend around that. Quiet strength, the ordinary background of financial transactions and routine clerical work reframed by her poised presence. The teller moved with renewed attention, fingers tapping keys with deliberate care, the printer humming softly as the receipt slid out with a muted thump onto the counter, and Evelyn accepted it, lifting the edge with gentle precision, noting the accuracy of the information without surprise. Her actions deliberate, steady, each motion echoing the control she had maintained throughout, and as she placed the paper in her purse, the subtle click of the clasp punctuating the moment. Mr. Hayes adjusted his stance, shoulders straightening in a way that conveyed acknowledgement, an understanding of the quiet impact she had made on the environment, the authority that had been challenged and corrected not through loud assertion, but through measured presence and clarity. And in the brief pause that followed, the bank lobby held its collective breath, as if time had slowed, waiting for the natural conclusion of this carefully balanced interaction. Evelyn's eyes traced the details of the space, the polished brass of the door handles, the subtle reflection of light off the marble, the soft sway of the plants placed near the windows, all elements ordinary yet rendered extraordinary by the tension that had passed through them, and she allowed herself a slight, controlled exhale, steadying her shoulders, knowing that the next steps would flow naturally from the order she had established without a word of confrontation. And as she lifted her gaze toward the exit, a faint flicker of curiosity from other customers met her eyes, their own movements tempered by the awareness of her influence, the quiet command she had exerted without raising her voice. Mr. Hayes' eyes lingered a moment longer, the faint trace of a reconsidered posture visible in the tilt of his head, the way his fingers rested lightly on the folder, and in that careful stillness, he conveyed a recognition that was not needed to be spoken aloud, a subtle nod of respect for the competence and dignity Evelyn embodied, and the gentle settling of the air around them marked the transformation of the space, from one of assumed authority to one balanced by the quiet, unwavering presence of an individual who had asserted her rights with clarity and poise. Shifting the dynamic entirely without a single raised tone, Evelyn turned slowly, her movements measured, the fabric of her coat brushing softly against her wrist, the polished floor reflecting her composed image as she moved toward the door, each step deliberate, unhurried, carrying the residual weight of the tension she had held and released. And in that silent motion, the bank lobby remained suspended in the quiet after the shift, ordinary sounds resuming but subtly altered, each breath, each shuffle, each click of a pen carrying with it the memory of the presence she had brought into the room, a presence that commanded attention not by volume but by integrity, clarity, and the unshakable calm she projected, leaving an impression that would linger, quietly reshaping the perception of authority and respect within the space without fanfare or confrontation. Evelyn Johnson paused just inside the threshold of the bank's glass doors, her hand resting lightly on the cool metal frame as she glanced back one last time at the lobby, the soft murmur of returning activity weaving through the polished marble and echoing subtly against the high ceilings, and she allowed her eyes to take in the details once more, the delicate flicker of light on the brass handles, the precise arrangement of chairs and counters, the slight tilt of a customer's head as they caught her gaze, and the gentle sway of the plants by the windows, all ordinary elements now colored by the quiet authority she had carried through the room. Mr. Carlton Hayes stood behind the counter, leaning lightly against the edge, his hands folded over the folder that had once been a tool of confrontation, his eyes meeting hers with a subtle recognition, the trace of earlier tension replaced by something measured and reflective, as if the balance of the space had shifted in ways he had not anticipated and could not entirely articulate. And for a moment the air seemed to hold itself, the faint hum of fluorescent lights above harmonizing with the subdued movements of tellers and customers alike. Each step, each shuffle, each soft click now part of a rhythm subtly altered by her presence. Evelyn took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the weight of her calm and clarity settle like a soft mantle around her shoulders, and she allowed herself a slight tilt of the head, a gesture neither triumphant nor submissive, but deliberate, acknowledging the unspoken awareness of those around her, the tentative curiosity of some customers, the softened posture of staff, and the almost imperceptible hesitation in Mr. Hayes' stance, which spoke more powerfully than any words could about the impact of patience, preparation, and quiet dignity in the face of authority. As she stepped further into the corridor, the polished floor reflecting the ambient light and the soft movement of her coat, the murmur of conversation resumed around her, but it carried a different tone, a subtle reverence born of the composure she had embodied, each ordinary sound now amplified in significance, from the shuffle of papers to the muted click of a pen to the distant hum of the ventilation system, and each element underscored the invisible change she had introduced to the space, the gentle, persistent force of presence that commanded attention without demanding it, and in that delicate suspension, the lobby felt lighter, more attentive, more aligned to the principle that respect can be conveyed as much by steadiness and clarity as by words or assertion. Evelyn's gaze swept past Mr. Hayes one final time, noting the slight ease in his shoulders, the softening of the line of his jaw, and the almost imperceptible nod that suggested internal reflection, and she allowed herself a slow, deliberate step back, her shoes making a quiet tap against the marble, the sound carrying softly through the hall, each movement deliberate, considered, an extension of the authority she had quietly claimed and maintained, and she felt the familiar steadiness of her rhythm settle into her own body, the sense of control not through confrontation, but through measured, unwavering composure, projecting clarity and integrity that resonated throughout the space. The tellers resumed their tasks with subtle shifts in demeanor, their hands moving more intentionally over keyboards and papers, the printer humming softly in its routine, yet the atmosphere carried a nuanced difference, a recognition that had not existed before, and Evelyn's presence lingered in the subtle glances exchanged between staff and customers, the almost imperceptible acknowledgement of her impact in the measured tilt of heads, the brief pause in conversation, the careful steps of a manager now considering more than procedure, the quiet reflection of authority meeting poise, and the ambient light accentuating the contours of her composed figure, the polished marble reflecting not just her image, but the weight of patience, dignity, and attention to detail, creating an almost tangible aura that filled the space as she moved with deliberate intention toward the exit, every step underscored by confidence, measured and unassuming, leaving a lingering impression of influence, of balance restored, of authority tempered by respect, a quiet testament to the power of clarity, preparation, and composure carried with subtlety and purpose throughout the room, setting the stage for the continued unfolding of consequence and acknowledgement that would follow in moments yet unseen. Evelyn Johnson paused at the threshold of the bank's lobby, her hand resting lightly on the brass handle, the polished surface cool under her fingers, and she turned her gaze back to the space she had just traversed, noticing the subtle transformations that had unfolded in the air, the slight softening in Mr. Carlton Hayes' posture, the tellers moving with renewed attentiveness, fingers tracing their tasks more carefully, a quiet awareness threading through each gesture, each movement, and Evelyn's eyes swept the room with measured calm, noting the subtle nods and glances of recognition, the way the customers shifted minutely, the quiet attention in their stance, all indicators of a change that had been wrought not with overt confrontation, but with composed presence and deliberate clarity. The soft hum of the ventilation system mixed with the faint tapping of keyboard keys and the distant shuffle of papers, creating a gentle rhythm that seemed to underscore the shift in dynamics. Each sound amplified by the tension that had dissipated into quiet acknowledgement, and Evelyn allowed herself a slow, controlled breath, grounding herself in the sensory details, the cool marble under her shoes, the faint scent of polished wood and ink, the subtle warmth from sunlight filtering through the large windows at the entrance, each element reinforcing the solidity and clarity she carried in her stance. Mr. Hayes' gaze lingered on her, the sharp lines of his jaw softened, the crease in his brow lessened, and his hands rested lightly over the edge of the counter as if he were measuring the exact weight of the presence before him. And in that silent assessment, the air held a delicate tension, the kind that does not require words to communicate recognition, acknowledgement, and reconsideration, as if the room itself had shifted imperceptibly, responding to the composure and clarity Evelyn projected. She spoke softly, deliberately, her words measured and clear. "Thank you for your attention." And though she did not raise her voice, the simple phrase carried authority and finality, each syllable resonating with the quiet power of certainty, and the murmur of the tellers and the soft shuffle of papers seemed to bend toward her cadence, as if the ordinary rhythm of the bank had momentarily aligned with her presence, marking the completion of a delicate negotiation in demeanor and awareness rather than confrontation. Evelyn straightened her shoulders slightly, her gaze lingering on Mr. Hayes for a subtle heartbeat, noting the faint acknowledgement in the tilt of his head, the gentle exhale he allowed himself, a quiet concession of recognition, and the lobby seemed to breathe with her, the air vibrating with the faint energy of a shift that had been silent yet undeniable, as ordinary actions, tellers placing forms in neat stacks, customers checking their belongings, a clerk adjusting the corner of her keyboard, took on new significance, echoing the subtle impact of her presence. She stepped forward, each footfall deliberate, the soft tap of her shoes on the marble floor echoing in the expansive space, her movement controlled and measured, carrying the quiet authority that had been established throughout the interaction, and the lobby responded, every observer attuned. The ordinary sounds of typing, papers shuffling, and distant conversations now punctuating the transformed environment rather than merely filling it. The soft rhythm reinforcing the recalibration of attention and respect that had quietly taken place. Evelyn's hand brushed briefly over the polished edge of the counter as she passed, a fleeting gesture of connection and closure, and she allowed herself a faint, subtle smile, acknowledging the completion of the transaction not as victory, but as a natural alignment, the balance restored through patience, preparation, and calm presence. And as she reached the glass doors, the light from the street outside casting long, soft shadows across the floor, she paused, letting the threshold frame her figure, the lobby behind her carrying the quiet resonance of a shift that had occurred, the subtle acknowledgement of integrity and composure rippling outward in silent recognition, leaving the space altered, measured, attentive, and reflective, a testament to the unspoken authority carried not through confrontation, but through clarity, patience, and unwavering poise. Evelyn Johnson stepped out onto the sidewalk, the late morning sunlight warming the marble steps behind her, and the crisp air carried a subtle energy that seemed to accentuate the calm that followed her through the bank doors, the distant hum of city traffic mingling with the occasional footstep of a passerby, creating a rhythm that underscored the quiet power she had exercised moments before. She paused, adjusting the strap of her worn leather purse across her shoulder, her eyes scanning the street with a steady, deliberate gaze, noting the small details that others might have overlooked, the flutter of a newspaper in a nearby pedestrian's hands, the reflection of sunlight across a glass storefront, the soft rustle of leaves from a tree planted beside the sidewalk, each element grounding her as she moved forward, a subtle presence commanding awareness without demanding it. Back inside the bank, Mr. Carlton Hayes remained at the counter, his posture more relaxed yet thoughtful, the soft folding of his hands on the polished surface a quiet signal of reflection, and the tellers continued their tasks with a new attentiveness. The rhythm of their movements slowed slightly, as if acknowledging the gravity of what had occurred, their subtle nods and measured gestures speaking to the unspoken respect Evelyn had inspired. As she descended the last step, the sidewalk stretching ahead, her shoes producing a gentle tap against the stone, a figure appeared at the edge of her vision. Tall, composed, with a presence that seemed to carry its own quiet authority, and Evelyn recognized him immediately. Vin Diesel, standing at the corner with a calm watchfulness that subtly shifted the energy of the space. The ambient city sounds fading slightly in the perception of those nearby, as attention gravitated toward him. Evelyn allowed a small, controlled breath, sensing the moment, feeling the quiet acknowledgement from him, and yet she maintained her measured composure, aware that This was another layer in the unfolding rhythm of influence, observation, and subtle authority, the city street now participating in the suspension of anticipation that had begun inside the bank. Mr. Hayes looked from the doorway to the street, noticing the figure, the faint adjustment of his tie betraying a subtle acknowledgement that he, too, perceived the layered dynamics of presence, influence, and the quiet authority that had moved through the bank and now extended beyond its doors, and he allowed himself a brief pause, the rhythm of the lobby still echoing faintly behind him, the soft shuffle of papers, the click of keyboards, all maintaining the subtle pulse that had been established earlier. Evelyn continued forward, each step deliberate, measured, her eyes briefly meeting those of pedestrians passing by, their attention flickering, curiosity and subtle recognition marking the brief encounters, and she noted the slight easing of tension in their posture. The small acknowledgement of dignity and composure carried effortlessly, without ceremony, a quiet statement of presence that resonated beyond the immediate interaction. The light from the morning sun caught the edges of her coat and the subtle contours of her face, highlighting the calm determination and measured patience that had guided every step of her day thus far. And as she walked, the distant sounds of traffic, a bird's chirp, and the faint rustle of wind through the trees layered over the residual memory of the bank lobby. The reflective surfaces of marble and glass now replaced with the gentle vibrancy of the street. Yet the same awareness, the same quiet authority, persisted within her posture, her gaze, her deliberate, controlled movements. Vin Diesel's presence remained at the edge of perception, a subtle confirmation of acknowledgement and support without interference. And Evelyn's path forward seemed to draw energy from that recognition, a continued rhythm of calm confidence that balanced observation, anticipation, and deliberate action, a testament to the power of composed clarity in the midst of expectation and authority, leaving both the city street and the memory of the bank lobby marked by the quiet but undeniable influence of her presence, measured, controlled, and unwavering. As she reached the crosswalk, the subtle pause in motion, the shifting light of the sun on the pavement, and the soft echoes of the bank behind her created a continuum of observation and acknowledgement, each element reinforcing the sense of purpose and impact she carried. The ordinary details of the urban environment now elevated by the quiet resonance of integrity, patience, and careful attention to presence, leaving an impression that extended beyond the immediate space into the broader rhythm of awareness surrounding her, a silent testimony to the composure and dignity she had maintained throughout, observed, acknowledged, and respected in ways that needed no words. Evelyn Johnson continued along the sidewalk, her footsteps measured and deliberate, each tap of her polished shoes on the concrete resonating softly with the rhythm of the morning city around her, and she allowed herself a moment to take in the subtle details, the glint of sunlight on a nearby building, the gentle sway of a tree bending in the breeze, the soft murmur of a distant conversation that blended with the hum of traffic, all ordinary elements now imbued with significance by the quiet authority she carried, the calm assurance that had flowed through the bank now traveling outward in waves, touching the awareness of those she passed. She adjusted the strap of her leather purse with an almost imperceptible motion, her fingers brushing the worn surface, feeling the familiar texture beneath her hand, grounding her in the physicality of her presence even as her mind reflected on the earlier moments of tension and resolution. And in that reflection, she felt a subtle satisfaction, not born of triumph, but of clarity, patience, and integrity, a quiet acknowledgement of what had been achieved without raising voice or imposing will, merely by occupying space with presence and composure. Back inside the bank, Mr. Carlton Hayes remained at the counter, his posture relaxed yet thoughtful, the subtle movements of his hands brushing against the polished surface as if weighing the impact of the earlier exchange, and his eyes, when they lifted, carried a new softness, a quiet reflection born of recognition, not arrogance, and his gaze lingered on the space Evelyn had vacated, noting the lingering awareness among the tellers and customers, the gentle adjustments in posture, the small, almost imperceptible nods of acknowledgement exchanged between those who had witnessed the scene, and a subtle energy had settled over the room, a silent acknowledgement of the quiet authority that had been exercised with grace. Evelyn's eyes caught Vin Diesel's presence at the edge of the street, standing tall with calm observation, his subtle nod and measured stance reinforcing the sense that the moment had been observed and acknowledged by someone attuned to presence and dignity. And she allowed herself a brief, controlled exhale, the faint shift in her shoulders carrying the ease of completion and the quiet confidence that had sustained her through the morning. The distant sounds of the city, the occasional honk, the soft footsteps of pedestrians, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, each element seemed to harmonize with the steady rhythm she maintained, the subtle cadence of composure and awareness weaving through the ordinary environment, transforming it into a space where quiet authority and dignity could be observed without a word, without ceremony, and yet recognized fully by those who were attentive. She walked past a small cafe, the scent of brewed coffee mingling with the morning air, a brief glance exchanged with a passerby whose expression shifted subtly in recognition, a silent acknowledgement that her presence carried weight beyond the immediate moment, and she felt the continuity of impact, the extension of the influence carried not by command but by clarity, poise, and unwavering attention to integrity. As she approached the corner where the traffic light changed, the subtle tilt of her head and the measured pace of her steps conveyed intention and purpose, her posture unwavering, and the ambient sounds of the city, the distant siren, the faint chatter, the soft rumble of a bus passing, formed a backdrop to the quiet assertion of presence, each element harmonizing with the deliberate rhythm she maintained, reinforcing the calm confidence that had been cultivated over decades, displayed now in the measured, unobtrusive way she navigated her environment. Mr. Hayes, watching from the bank window, followed her movement with a thoughtful gaze. The subtle lines of his face softened in reflection, and he noted the ripple of attention her passage caused, the slight pauses, the small glances, the subtle recognition from those who observed, all of which conveyed respect without overt acknowledgement, the quiet demonstration of influence achieved without confrontation, and he exhaled slowly, the tension of earlier minutes dissipating, replaced with measured awareness of dignity exercised through calm, deliberate action. Evelyn paused briefly at the intersection, sunlight catching the edges of her coat and the contours of her face, the soft reflection of glass and stone blending with the natural light, and she allowed a moment to feel the subtle continuation of presence, the quiet impact radiating outward, a testament to the power of clarity, preparation, and composed authority carried through every deliberate step, leaving an impression that would extend far beyond the bank lobby, a quiet, enduring influence on both space and perception. And as she moved forward into the flow of the city, the rhythm of her movement, measured and unassuming, continued to speak to the unspoken recognition she had earned, the silent authority of integrity, patience, and dignity observed by all who witnessed. Evelyn Johnson stepped fully onto the street, the sunlight glinting softly off the edges of her coat and casting subtle reflections across the polished sidewalks, and she paused for a moment, feeling the faint hum of the city around her, the gentle rhythm of distant traffic, the soft swish of a pedestrian passing, and the faint rustle of leaves stirred by the morning breeze, each detail grounding her in the present while the sense of quiet authority she carried radiated outward, touching the awareness of everyone nearby without a word being spoken, and the soft shuffle of people moving around her seemed to bend subtly to the tempo she maintained, measured and deliberate, the air itself somehow quieter, more attentive. At the corner, Vin Diesel moved slightly, stepping into the sunlight in a way that seemed both casual and deliberate, his presence a quiet confirmation, a subtle reinforcement of acknowledgement, his gaze meeting hers briefly, an almost imperceptible nod bridging the space between observation and recognition, and Evelyn felt a measured reassurance in that silent affirmation, the layered presence of authority and respect intersecting in the shared awareness of the moment. Back inside the bank, Mr. Carlton Hayes watched from behind the polished glass, his expression reflective, shoulders eased, the tension of earlier moments softened into quiet consideration, and his hands rested lightly over the folder on the counter, the subtle crease of thought evident as he reconsidered every assumption he had held moments before, the faint rustle of papers, the soft clatter of keyboards, and the almost imperceptible movements of the tellers underscoring the shift, a silent acknowledgement of the change wrought by calm clarity and measured presence. Evelyn began walking down the sidewalk, each step deliberate, her posture straight, her gaze focused yet unobtrusive, and the city's ordinary sounds. The distant honk of a horn, the soft murmur of conversation, the occasional tap of a pedestrian's shoes on concrete, intertwined with the echo of her earlier actions, giving them weight and resonance, subtly shaping the awareness of those she passed, drawing their eyes, if only momentarily, to the quiet confidence and integrity she embodied, and in that simple, deliberate motion, the influence of her presence extended beyond the bank, carrying the balance she had established into the wider space of the street. The ambient sunlight caught the contours of her face, the shadows softening the lines of expression into calm determination, and Evelyn's eyes tracked the small details around her, noting the reflection of passing windows, the faint tilt of a passerby's head, the subtle adjustment of a jacket, the casual glance of a pedestrian acknowledging the presence of someone carrying composure and measured authority, and each observation reinforced the quiet, controlled power she had exercised, the influence moving outward without fanfare, commanding attention only through clarity, patience, and integrity. Vin Diesel remained at a respectful distance, his figure a stabilizing presence, the soft rhythm of his movement harmonizing with hers, a silent endorsement of observation, awareness, and recognition. While the light played across the urban landscape, glinting off polished surfaces, reflecting softly off street signs, windows, and car hoods, creating a visual harmony that underscored the composure Evelyn carried. And as she reached the midpoint of the block, her movements were unhurried, deliberate, each step echoing softly against the sidewalk, the cumulative rhythm of presence, awareness, and acknowledgement extending outward to touch the city environment. She allowed a brief pause, the sunlight falling across her shoulders, a faint breeze brushing the fabric of her coat, and she felt the quiet satisfaction of purpose achieved, the subtle shift she had enacted in the bank lobby now resonating through the street, through observation and recognition rather than confrontation, each sound, each movement, each glance aligning with the gentle assertion of authority she carried. Mr. Hayes' reflection caught in the window of a nearby storefront, and he adjusted his tie subtly, the gesture small but telling, a quiet internal acknowledgement of the influence that had extended beyond the interior of the bank, reaching into the external space and affecting perception, awareness, and consideration without the need for words. Evelyn continued forward, her steps steady, measured, aware of the continuity of presence and influence, each movement deliberate, her gaze scanning subtly, her posture a testament to integrity and composure. The ordinary urban space now infused with the quiet authority she embodied, resonating in the attention of bystanders, the rhythm of the city, and the reflective surfaces that caught the light, her influence leaving an impression that extended beyond the immediate moment, shaping awareness through calm, clarity, and deliberate poise. A silent assertion of dignity and measured authority that would linger long after she had passed. Evelyn Johnson reached the corner where the sunlight poured over the city sidewalk, illuminating the subtle textures of her coat and the gentle creases of her face, and she paused to take a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the quiet weight of the morning behind her. The bank lobby left in stillness, now just a memory, the soft echoes of footsteps, shuffling papers, and murmured acknowledgments lingering in her mind like a faint reverberation of the authority she had quietly exercised. Vin Diesel, standing a short distance away, shifted slightly, his presence both subtle and grounding, a silent confirmation that the rhythm of integrity and calm she carried had been observed, and Evelyn allowed herself a controlled exhale, the morning air brushing softly against her cheeks, carrying the faint scent of coffee from a nearby cafe and the distant aroma of street trees, a sensory backdrop that framed the culmination of the interactions that had unfolded earlier, every small detail reinforcing the quiet authority she maintained. As she began walking again, each step measured, the gentle tap of her polished shoes on the concrete providing a steady cadence. Evelyn scanned the subtle movements of the pedestrians around her, noticing glances that lingered a fraction longer than usual, a slight tilt of a head, a soft smile, an adjustment in posture, all imperceptible acknowledgments of the presence she carried. The influence of composure, preparation, and dignity radiating outward in ways that required no overt declaration. Mr. Carlton Hayes remained in the bank, visible through the reflective glass, his stance thoughtful and unhurried, hands lightly folded over the edge of the counter, the subtle tension of the morning now replaced with a measured reflection, his gaze lingering on the space she had occupied, registering the quiet change in energy, the respectful awareness in the tellers and customers, the adjustments of subtle glances and careful gestures, the slow alignment of ordinary motions with the weight of her integrity. And in that suspended moment, the bank lobby seemed to hold itself, imbued with recognition and consideration that had been earned without confrontation, without raised voice, simply through presence and consistency. Evelyn allowed her eyes to sweep over the urban landscape before her, the subtle reflections of sunlight on glass and polished surfaces catching her attention, the faint hum of distant traffic blending with the rhythm of the city, each ordinary sound harmonizing with the silent resonance of influence and awareness she carried, and the soft rustle of leaves and distant pedestrian movements formed a gentle accompaniment to the controlled cadence of her steps, each one deliberate, each one a quiet statement of authority and balance, a tangible presence without aggression, commanding acknowledgement through clarity and composure. Vin Diesel's quiet observation continued, his figure blending into the periphery of the street, yet maintaining an aura of attention that reinforced the significance of her measured movement, the interaction of presence and perception extending beyond the immediate vicinity, touching the awareness of those nearby without overt declaration, an affirmation of dignity recognized subtly through observation. And Evelyn felt the continuity of purpose in the calm rhythm of her walk, the city street reflecting the quiet authority she had projected, its ordinary noises harmonized with the residual tension and acknowledgement of earlier moments. As she approached the next crosswalk, the soft glare of sunlight highlighted her deliberate steps, her posture straight, gaze steady, the ambient sounds, the distant rumble of a bus, the muted chatter of conversations, the faint echo of footsteps, layered naturally into the rhythm she maintained, reinforcing the continuity of her influence without a word, the quiet authority she carried now, fully integrated into the perception of the street, the lingering impression of integrity and composure shaping the awareness of all who observed, and every element, the light, the movement, the soft rustle of air, the reflection of polished surfaces, seemed to reinforce the resonance of dignity, clarity, and calm control she had established throughout the morning, a silent testimony to the enduring effect of patience, presence, and measured poise, leaving an impression that extended far beyond the immediate moment, subtly aligning observation, awareness, and respect in a space once ordinary, but now quietly transformed by her integrity and deliberate presence.